Hey guys, what is up? It is M.I.Diverse, the weekly, we try to be weekly podcast talk show where we try to keep staying subject. We really do. And well, last week we did say we were going to do some fandom stuff, but we decided to shake it up a little bit. So we're going to be talking about something mystical, magical. I'm not trying to quote Benson Boone here. I'm just trying to say we're talking about fairy tales this week. Brought to us by John. So John brought this up, and I was like, maybe it probably would be a good idea. We will try to go for more fandom type culture in the coming weeks. I think what we will do instead of just fandom month, we're gonna do a little bit of a kind of a fandomy season. Or if anything, we're just gonna sprinkle fandom culture into our discussions over the summer because conventions are coming up and around. So anyway, let's get started. Oh, one more thing, please. I'm gonna say it before and at the end of the video. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Please share, do all the fun stuff. So, all right, who wants to start? Because my brain is already racking.
I was about to say I could start.
Okay, please.
I do want to say that yes, fairy tales could kind of be literally the start of fandom, kind of before fandom even became a thing. It could
Ooh,
be considered as the start of fandom.
yeah,
So we're
really, when
not
you
really off
think about
topic,
it,
guys. We're not
it's
actually
not
that.
necessarily off topic. Yeah, it in a way because these things have been shared for like decades upon decades, and you get people going to festivals, sometimes dressed as fairy tale characters. So in the broad sense of the word, it technically is a type of fandom. So,
Yes.
uh, Jenna, I see you raise your hand a little bit ago. What you had a thought?
No, um, well, one of the things that I don't mean to, because something I wanted to mention is that they did, and the reason why a lot of these fairy tales must have been like they're probably a lot older than most people realize
Mm-hmm.
because they were originally oral storytelling traditions
Yes.
that were passed down before they were written down, and oftentimes characters, motifs, and moral lessons vary across cultures that reflect whatever local values or belief
Yeah.
systems that they came from.
Yeah, because I talked about it behind the scenes or before we started recording. Like, yeah, some of these fairy tales and myths and stuff, they were kind of perpetuated because they were more like bedtime stories you would tell your kids to basically get them to behave in a sense or whatever. You know, I obviously there's some of these stories that are a little bit more only like 200 years old. Some of them are like centuries old. So it's just really how they're kind of perpetuated over like the decades or in some cases centuries. So, I think it's just that is kind of funny. It's kind of funny to think about how a lot of these stories are like things that are usually were just kind of things to make sure kids would be good and you know let me see how long I've been talking, not be little shits if you know what I mean. So go ahead, Jenna.
Oh, one thing I should have said this at the beginning. Disclaimer: we are not claiming to be experts on how fairy tales work. There's a lot of
Mm-mm.
scholarly debate about what counts as a fairy tale, what even counts as like a folk tale, and what are like differentiatings. There's a lot because there is a lot of like overlap and sometimes differentiating. So it's like this is just our I guess you will, our armchair thoughts on these sorts of things.
Our armchair thoughts, our opinions, don't take this as gospel, please. We're just three people that barely even know what we're talking about. We're trying to know what we're talking about. So yeah, no, John, you you some mentioned some parts in your notes and I really want to get into them. So, do you want to introduce at least one part of your note that we can kind of go over?
So we went over basically what is a fairy tale. So basically, a fairy tale is a short story, but is meant to be a lesson or value of humanity to others, and also basically just teaching different morals of the stories. And so the meaning behind fairy tales, and to understand a fairy tale is to understand the times and cultures of that time and backstory of the individual authors who wrote those fairy tales. Like, you can definitely see that there's definitely a difference between in the writings of fairy tales. There's a difference between Hans Christian Andersen and the Grimm's brothers, and like the way that they kind of change, kind of not exactly mirror each other, but how they have like different styles of writing.
And actually, one thing I did want to mention is that, to be clear, it's not like especially like the Grimm brothers, they didn't like write. They didn't like fully originate from like those two people. They were just collecting what they were
Yeah,
just collecting uh fairy tales, folk tales that were around that period. So who even knows what the original authors of those tales even were?
true,
Yeah.
true.
So it's a lot of these stories that are appropriate, not appropriated, but yeah, it's collected. And the most famous ones are really just um, would you say a compendium
Like it's
Mm,
of
a
like
like collection of fairy tales that
yes,
like one author or two, like in the case of the Grimm brothers, they just collected a bunch of German folk tales, fairy tales that were around at that period.
yeah, and that's the thing. It's kind of funny is like a lot of the more popular, more what's the word I'd be looking for? Commercialized ones
mhm.
that we see in the past 100 years are Germanic, French, Anglo-European type stories. I mean, John mentioned this in the notes, but I'm kind of going to break the ice on it.
Mhm.
Is a lot of the Disney tales are like are based off of all these Grimm brother like folk tales. I mean, not all of them, a lot. You take a look at obviously Little Mermaid is one. Then also, oh, I was gonna say Beauty and the Beast is more of like a French folktale, especially from like the area it originates.
Mhm.
Then Pinocchio owes its own story. That's also a very, especially the setting of the story is very Germanic in
Well, it's actually
Dutch,
Pinocchio is Italian, I
Italian.
think.
Yes, Italian. So I think my statement of like the Anglo-European still kind of holds that. Obviously, the Italians aren't all necessarily no, they are European, but it's a different
Totally different
classification. I would
culture.
say it's a different culture, different classification. So yeah, no, but John had this really good idea of like talking about the differences. I don't know if you wanted to wait for that or do you want to try to get into that right now about the differences between how I'll let you explain it.
I think it's a matter of just knowing that like Disney tends to lighten up the fairy tales, the original from the originals. They tend to lighten up their versions of the stories. And you've also got to realize also that they're going through the standpoint of a cartoon. And that's why their approach is so different and lighthearted, is because they're trying to tell these stories to a new generation of kids, but in a like different setting, totally different way, and a very creative way at that, of how do we approach a fairy tale to the modern audience. So yeah.
Yeah, no, and I get it. Obviously, back in the day, we had had all the I can't talk. You had animators and animation studios like Mickey Mouse, Walt Disney, Mickey Mouse, all the people that were doing like Warner Brothers stories. Like, obviously they did their own versions of the retelling, but in their way, they were retelling it in a more kid friendly, sanitized way.
Yeah.
Back in the day, just because of a lot of the, I don't want to say cultural biases or cultural fears of what to show for kids at the time, and that's kind of still.
I think.
Yeah, no,
I think some of it. I think some of it is also like during subsequent later generations, it seems like kids have started to become more baby down towards, started to become a bit condescended towards. Like, if that makes
Oh
any
no,
sense, because
no,
it's like,
that's
I mean,
100% true.
of course, some of like these quote unquote dark fairy tales, and yes, there are some elements that are dark, but well, first off, some of them are not even that dark to begin with, and
Mm.
second off, it's I mean, like you said, a lot of it is just cultural values and
Yeah.
like they really got they don't pull any punches here. They have to really tell these kids to obey. Like don't be stupid. Don't be stupid.
I was gonna say, like, I would think that, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the story, is couldn't you take away that the original story of the Little Mermaid is not to run away from home, in a sense, in the broad term? If that's a broad stroke. There's obviously probably other layers to the story, but obviously in the original context of the story, Ariel sold her. I don't think it was necessarily her voice in the original story, but she sold a major part of her. And once she got to land, when she walked on the ground, stepping on the ground felt like she was stepping on glass, and then she turned into sea foam, like right at the end. A lot of people react to that. It's like, oh my god, that's so dark. It's like, you're only imagining it to be as dark as like you want it to be. It probably could be a lot more mundane. It's just, yeah.
Well, I think the one thing that in the way of like when I was creating my merman, I kind of consider my merman comics as kind of like a modern fairy tale to some
Mhm.
point, to some degree. But one of the things is that how the Little Mermaid came when Hans Christian Andersen came up with the concept was through heartbreak.
Mhm.
Hans Christian Andersen had fallen in love with a man,
Mhm.
and he was telling this guy, "Don't marry this woman," because this guy sent a letter to Hans Christian Andersen saying, "Hey, I'm gonna go marry this woman, just letting you know." And he's basically saying, "Don't do it. Please don't do this. I really care about you as a woman would." And the guy decided to marry the woman anyway. And Hans Christian Andersen obviously was heartbroken about it. So
Mhm.
how does he let out his heartbreak but to write a fairy tale about a mermaid? And a lot of people don't understand it. It's like in the story. The mermaid doesn't talk in The Little Mermaid towards the end because Hans Christian Andersen couldn't talk to anybody about his feelings towards this man.
Mhm.
So that's why the mermaid doesn't talk, and that's why the mermaid dies because of
Mhm.
heartbreak.
Yeah.
So rather than killing the prince, she just decides, I don't want to ruin this guy's life because of me. So
Yeah.
might as well just, see ya.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and
I was
and actually, sorry, it's like and actually, this brings up a point about like it's also just important to understand where these stories actually originate from so we can have that background as to why did they place certain emphasis on these certain things at all.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and I think that's why the tale of the Little Mermaid in the context of Hans Christian Andersen works so well, is because he's writing it through a different lens, even though it is his own personal story about heartbreak. I think that what still makes it work so well is because, giving that context, it does make the walking on the ground is very much like stepping on glass. It's walking on eggshells is kind of what, trying to tell people, not wanting to tell people a secret that could possibly get you hurt or whatever. And, obviously the dying from heartbreak kind of goes along the same way for, her dying at sea because she didn't want to hurt the man that she loved. Not dying at sea, but, turning into sea foam because she didn't want to kill the man she loved. Having that context, and obviously we've talked about this in the writing episode, having a sort of like context to tell that kind of story really elevates the quality of the story because you experienced the story. Obviously, you can still probably tell a story, but putting your own history into that, I would say, elevates the quality of the story.
Yeah, which then brings up to my next point of people tend to complain about fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
So people tend to complain about fairy tales because, as we've mentioned, they don't understand the reason, they don't understand the culture of where it came from. And this is a big deal when it comes to like a lot of, shall I say, misconceptions about fairy tale princesses, particularly. That being like, well, for example, they say like Snow White ran off to, go live in a cottage and later marry a man. First of all, this is where I'd like to plug in my original fairy tale play, the Fairest of Them All, a retelling of the fairy tale of Snow White. And in my play, this is a line I wrote in my show, which I really love, which Snow White tells her brother that she didn't leave the castle to be with a man. She left because she didn't want to die.
Yeah.
Now,
Because
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, because that's essentially what happened. Is that she was
Exactly.
trying to escape? She was trying to escape the evil queen. That was how like. And I feel like sorry to walk on your speech real quick, but
That's fine.
the other thing that just kind of is so weird is when like, because I almost feel like some people just kind of took one look at like, I don't know, Sleeping Beauty or something, and they just assumed that every single like story must be like a damsel in distress story, when it's like, no, they aren't. Because like, for like you mentioned, Snow White was trying to escape from a evil queen. And even in something like East of the Sun, West of the Moon, it's the woman that goes to save a man. So it's like, and also we have the story of Vasilia, which is which, like, she was she was trying to survive. It was basically kind of like I think it's like a Russian version of Cinderella, essentially. Well, kind similar, but yeah, where both of the female characters are just trying to survive, essentially. So it's kind of like, that kind of perception almost comes from people who haven't either like read enough, or they just completely misunderstand what exactly like happens in some of these fairy tales.
Yeah, exactly. I really think that like when people don't understand and realize, these girls aren't weak. That's the number one thing I really want to say to people who do love these fairy tale characters. These girls aren't weak. They just happen to be in situations where they have their strength tested.
And even in something like Snow White, where a man just so happens to show up, it's like they weren't even trying to look for a guy. The guy just happened to show up.
Yeah, that kind of makes
the truth.
Yeah, kind of part of it kind of makes it seem like it's more of the marketability of these Disney movies adding I don't want to say white savior, or like not white savior specifically, but the man comes in to save the day type thing. That was like a big thing in like the 40s to 60s and that kind of thing. And obviously it's still kind of a thing now, but like obviously we have more female centric stories that have the female be the hero too. But the context of like some of the older stories do still have like women being the heroes of their own stories, where these retellings from like back 40, 60, 100 years ago, almost in some cases, they are, I don't want to say more sanitized for an American audience, but like, they kind of are.
Well, one of the things, like for example, one of the reasons I like the animated movie Tangled is that Rapunzel and Flynn save each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great because I want to see more. I would actually like to see more fairy tales or fairy tale like stories where it's not just one side is saving one side of the characters and the other character saving the other one. I want to see stories where they're saving each other.
Yeah.
That isn't
I
weak. I'm sorry, guys, but Rapunzel saving Flynn is not a weakness.
I think I I was gonna say, I think it really started with Little Mermaid in a sense, probably maybe a little bit earlier,
Mhm.
but I think like the post Renaissance Disney era really kind of brought back the f- the female character or the princess of the story, isn't just some damsel in distress to be saved. She's not just like a prize to be won. She has her own arc. She has her own like story to be told, and you know, obviously, I think, at least from my perspective, I'm could definitely be wrong, and please correct me. Is I still like to think like obviously the story Mulan is definitely not like Germanic tale. That's like a Chinese folklore tale, and even then, that's probably like has like several amendments to it anyway.
Mhm.
But having the female character go from you know being in a role of damsel in distress to being basically the hero of China, that I believe I like to think it's very empowering. I think it's very empowering. But go ahead, Jenna. Go ahead.
Yeah. And actually, before we go any further with stuff like that, and also with adaptations, I do want to address we've been speaking a lot about fairy tales, but I feel like some people kind of don't really know what fairy tale actually means per se. And this is something that I've been like looking up, and some of the characteristics that I've noticed that I saw was like the inclusion of magic in fantastical settings, very clear distinction between good and evil with archetypal roles, sometimes conveyed as life lessons in a simplified, straightforward plot, unlike the more complex narratives in other genres, like with regular fantasy. The villain gets their comeuppance in a brutal way, some like in some of the versions. uh, a hero going on a journey filled with struggle and triumph, uh, patterns that occur in 3 or 7. Often they have happy endings, uh, themes and elements of like love, courage, transformation, those sorts of things. And something that I've like noticed is that I feel like there is a distinction between folk tales and fairy tales,
Mm-hmm.
because folk tales, at least from my experience, they are more grounded in reality somewhat, while fairy tales have the presence of magic. And granted, the like I said, the whole debate around what even counts as a fairy tale is still somewhat ongoing, but one thing that I will say is that because first off, the presence of elements like talking animals and plot and common plot elements don't always qualify a story as a fairy tale. And second off, from what I actually saw, what distinguishes fairy tales from regular fantasy stories, primarily from what I've seen, is their length and the depth of world building. So something I found really interesting is that stories like The Hobbit and The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, they were actually classified as fairy tales before the term fantasy was even invented. So so the term for fantasy genre seems to be a more recent invention.
Yeah, or at least like the classification of fantasy or fairy tale is, it probably is just more like tales or folk tales. I mean, obviously you have situations where I would say situations, but then you also have I kind of want to say I wanted to segue into it. I really don't think I'm going to discuss it very far. Is actually also mythology also it kind of goes not toe to toe, but drives parallel to
I
fairy
mean,
tales. But there's a lot of what I would say overlap, but there's mystical settings. So that's
well,
really the furthest I think I should really get into that.
the thing is that mythology from what I've because I'm a very mythology and folklore kind of
Mm-hmm.
person. So the thing that I've learned about mythology is that they're essentially why things are the way that they are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how did the world came to be? Why do snakes have no legs?
Yeah.
Or why why do humans walk on 2 feet? You know, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. That's usually within the category of mythology. Meanwhile, like I said, fairy tales are
Or
usually just, they're very, very simple. They're magical yet simple, and you're really not meant to think too deeply about how all of this stuff works, and relying a lot on suspension of disbelief.
yeah, it's just basically the mythology is really just kind of telling a tall tale to explain why this thing works, while fairy tale is just more of telling a tale just to kind of really tell a tale to get like kids to behave and such. It's but they're not obviously they're not one and the same. They aren't one and the same, and that's not what I was insinuating. So
Yeah. And John, what are your thoughts on all this? You were in the thinking position.
the thinking
Was
face.
um no, you're definitely right. There is definitely a difference between fairy tale and folklore because sometimes you will come across stories that are considered as folklore
Mm-hmm.
regarding like the like for example when people talk about like the fairy people in Ireland
Mm-hmm.
or the like other like some like other fairy like beings in Greece or something to that matter of like it's good to have the folklore stories too
Yes.
along with yes it is nice to have the fairy tale stories as well but the folklore stories seem to tend to get more into the cultures of those
Yes.
places.
Hmm.
Yes. I mean, obviously, there's like the stories in Greco-Roman like mythology and such, with especially like warriors like Heracles, or in Chinese mythology, Sun Wukong. There's a lot of these stories that, even though a lot of the stories that surround these characters try to explain how the world works, there's a lot of fantastical elements to them. Obviously, that's really kind of that was the thought I was having is like you have these characters that feel like they are more specifically just I wouldn't say insert characters, but when you have folklore that helps explain things and then you have a specific character that gets inserted that I wouldn't say necessarily affects the broader explanation of how certain things work. Like it's saying, oh, the I'm just paraphrasing here. It's like, oh, the thunder god Zeus, or the father of the god Zeus is the one that like throws the fire, the thunder. His wife Hera had a son Heracles, and then Heracles goes on these trials and adventures and such. There is stuff that does help explain, but I feel, but there's broader stuff that goes into it because obviously you get situations like the Gorgon or possibly the Cyclops or Cerberus and all that kind of stuff. That kind of goes more into the fantastical rather than the mythological. But that's just
So, in other words, it's all very complicated with a lot of overlapping going on here. So So I don't know. We're people smarter than us can probably figure this out.
Yeah. Because like how the it's just one of those things where it's kind of hard to like say, and I only brought Heracles up because they made a Disney Hercules adaptation back in the 90s. So, it's and I think I mentioned it earlier, but a lot of it's marketability because I think with like the Hans Christian Andersen or Little Mermaid movie adaptation, obviously it's a bright and cheery ending. They get married in the end compared to the original story where she dies of heartbreak like at the beach and such. Then you go over to the tale of Hercules, and then Hera makes Hercules go mad, and then he goes on a basically a killing spree. Disney ended up just like making everything like a happy ending. Hercules gives up his demigodhood so he can be with Megara, and Megara has her whole mythology and everything thing. The Disney-fied stories are very much what is the most what's the word I'm looking for the most bare bones way we can tell the story while
what's
telling
the most marketable way?
Yes, but it's the most marketable way to tell a story. I think is it is just kind of funny like how these corporations make a very sellable version of the story compared to something that probably would be like a prime time. I wouldn't say prime time, but I definitely don't think American parents and maybe kids would be able to handle certain aspects of these stories, especially if some of the parts that get a little bit saucy. But it's it's complicated.
And actually, now that we're getting into adaptations of fairy tales, so like there's like a lot of you can take adaptations in so many different ways.
Yeah.
And something I've noticed is that some adaptations of fairy tales that want to be a dark retelling, it's like some of them just try way too hard to be hardcore and adult and mature that it ends up becoming tacky and obnoxious and often removing the whimsical fantasy element that makes fairy tales special to people. And it also just comes across like they don't actually like fairy tales and want an excuse to dunk on them, or even like when they want to play around with the morality of good and evil, but they just take the lazy route of swapping the hero and villain roles without actually displaying anything remotely morally complex, and it ends up becoming a generic good versus evil story. Or they claim to be subversive, but they play all the tropes straight as they are without any semblance of creativity. Like, for example, and this is something that we brought up, like a princess picking up a sword is no longer really subversive. And it wasn't even that subversive to begin with.
Mhm.
And my same thoughts are on like comedic retellings or adding self-awareness to it. So like you don't want to be constantly cynical about everything.
Yeah, I mean, I like, for example, when you were talking about the like, um, it was the one thing that we were talking about like, what was the word? I'm sorry, brain fart here. um, there was going to be an adaptation of The Little Mermaid, where they were gonna have Chloe Grace Moretz. She was gonna play the Little Mermaid, and when they announced this is one of the adaptations I think of as a missed opportunity. And so she was basically announced to be playing the Little Mermaid. They were gonna do a modern telling of the Hans Christian Andersen version of the Little Mermaid. So when when they were going to do this, you watch all these interviews that this girl was in about talking about playing the Hans Christian Andersen version. So the first two questions they ask is, "Oh, are you going to have the red hair, or are you going to have a green tail?" And this is what happens when you because I think it's really sad because the only version of the Little Mermaid people tend to know is Ariel, because I feel like there's a lack of exposure to the Hans Christian Andersen version. There's a lack of exposure to
Yeah.
this version of the character. So when these interviewers are asking, "Oh, are you going to have a red? Are you going to be like? Are you going to do a red wig, or are you going to dye your hair red?" And Chloe Grace Moretz just keeps saying, "We're not doing that. We're doing the Hans Christian Andersen version," as
Yeah.
if these people are too effing stupid to not know the difference between the Disney version and the Hans Christian Andersen version.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I don't want to say ruins some of the potential of some of these adaptations is that we're so used to the if you make a new version of something that Disney did 150, 60, 30 years ago, people will just compare it to that version. So if you try to be more not natural or try to be more accurate to the books, then people are going to compare it to ori- the Disney movie rather than the actual story. I was going to say, obviously, what we're trying to say, I don't want to say. I don't think the Del Toro Pinocchio is not very accurate either, but I think a lot of people were comparing the Del Toro Pinocchio to the old Pinocchio. But I think they do that a lot of the time. A lot. I don't even think that really, you know, it pertains to it. That's not the right word. It happens a lot to a lot of works where much older adaptation gets compared to a new adaptation gets compared to a much older adaptation. But there's a lot of problems with like talking about in mythology or not mythology, fairy tales. We're talking about fairy tales when the most famous, most marketable adaptation technically isn't really accurate to the original story because it's the most sanitized, marketable version of the story. So yeah, no,
Yeah.
no,
It's like any like if you're gonna make an adaptation of a book that Disney already adapted for their movie, it's like anything that Disney touches and you want to make an adaptation of the book or the whatever that they adapted, there's automatically going to be comparisons just because how big Disney is and how much they shove their IPs in everyone's faces.
I was gonna say, we mentioned Wizard of Oz. I was gonna say the first one was not very accurate at all, but if I remember right, other subsequent Oz adaptations actually did a lot better job at adapting some of the source material compared to the movie that they did in the 30s.
I mean,
But a lot of people compared it to the original movie, the first movie compared to the books. But that's the furthest I want to really get into that.
yeah, granted, first off, that 1930s production was absolute hell to work on. So
Oh
it's not
yeah,
like they
no,
had anything. It's
100%.
not like they had room to really like do anything. And second off, a lot of the adaptations, like some of the adaptations that I've known about or like I've seen somewhere is like they seem to be more trying to adapt the overall Wizard of Oz mythology, like the overall lore, like the Wizard of Oz books, like the whole series, rather than just the first one. Or so I some there are some that try to like adapt the just the first one. I don't know.
Hmm.
Here's a question for you guys. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on this. Um, how many versions of an adaptation of a fairy tale is too much? I've always thought about this for some reason. Like, there's so many adaptations of a certain fairy tale, but how many do you think is too much?
Sometimes I think one is too much.
I
Um,
think I think the part where it gets too much for me is when they have nothing new to say about
yeah,
these things. It's like and like now this isn't to say that they can't play with like darker or potential horror aspects of fairy tales. Like for example, when I was actually reading through the original Sleeping Beauty, the reason the whole events happen in the story is because a fairy wasn't invited. And back in those times, fairies or fair creatures of that nature, whatever they were called, were taken very seriously to a point where slighting them in some way, even if seemingly inconsequential, can have dire consequences. So maybe exploring the almost otherworldly morality of these creatures that we as humans can't fully comprehend. It's like I'm not there's potential for it. And so when these people like I said try to uh insert any sort of like um dark or mature themes in a very surface level way, or they try to be all too cynical about it, that's when it's like, okay, we got do you even care about what you are writing anymore?
yeah.
I mean,
I
oh, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
I was about to say, I mean, I've written a Sleeping Beauty screenplay, so I care.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it doesn't. This happens a lot in other types of stories or movies and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, when you get a lot of, I guess I'll just like shoot shoot my shot with it. You take a look at the Star Wars movies. A lot of them kind of retread specific plot points a lot of the time, especially the first trilogy and the sequel trilogy kind of retread similar plot points. If you know what I mean. Obviously, it's trying to be a handoff the pass the torch to the new generation, but like they're basically still telling the same story, but in the context of this is the new generation. There's not really much to tell. There's not really much to retell for this story. They're just like, hey, we're bringing back these characters, but we're putting him in the role of the older character from the older movie, so to speak. But I feel if actually no, I'm not gonna say it, but that that does happen, and not in just like fairy tale films too. That happens in modern cinema as well, but sometimes it's just it's I would say it's Ouroboros But when you've already told the story and you're just trying to tell the story again, but with the original characters as older characters, everybody already knows the story beats. Some people do want more original stories with these much older versions of these characters. But that's here and there. That's here and there. John, you did have at least, I believe, one or two more notes. We could at least take 7 minutes to at least go over one.
Well, I think the last one, I think how we could end this episode today on the last one is, do fairy tales hold true to today? Or do we think they hold true to today?
Well, something about fairy tales is that they're almost meant to be timeless and relevant to all generations, because a lot of the times they have themes, like no matter which culture, they have themes that are very universal. And so whenever a story or whatever, an adaptation, try to add any random modern elements that don't naturally tie back to the themes of the story, but are in a vain attempt to be modern, it's like it makes no sense. It just doesn't feels like you're trying. It's just it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, no, I get that, and yeah, if you're adding too much of a modern part of the story of whatever modern part of the culture into the original story, it really takes away from the story. It doesn't add anything to the story. You're just adding. Obviously, I think there's ways you can
Although
adapt like certain fairy tales or stories into modern context, but sometimes it just doesn't really add much to the story. Go ahead, Jenna.
And even like something like a modern story, or even like a dark retelling of fairy tales, like they can have room for childlike wonder, and that's really what makes fairy tales unique, is that they have this air of whimsy and etherealness to them. Is that, the concept of in the darkest of dark, the light will be the brightest, or something, how it goes.
I think when it comes to adapting a fairy tale, this is what I had learned when I was writing my play, was yes, you can bring in new elements to the fairy tale adaptation, but really, really stick to why we love the story in the first place. Don't lose what we love about it. And unfortunately, with these modern Disney remakes, they don't tend to understand they don't understand the fairy tale itself. It's not like they're trying to keep what we love about it in the aspect of any adaptations of those. And when I was writing my play, I I did want to bring in a new character into the story, and I wanted to bring in a new plot line into the story. But it was a matter of, okay, I want to bring in this new thing, but how do I interweave the plot points into the story that it makes sense? Because if I just add a random character and none of the plot makes sense, then the whole plot and the whole story just falls apart.
Yeah.
So,
Or even like what it feels like what the Disney live action remakes are doing. It feels like they're just going on to random Disney forums and trying to explain every single little detail about why is this, why is that? But it's like that actually kind of makes it work, but they end up making it worse.
Yeah, because what was the last movie that was just like literally it was the story of the movie just in live action, wasn't it? It's like Snow White, or which one was it? I'm really trying to remember right now.
like Lion King or something. I don't know.
Oh yeah, I think
It might have been. It might have been. I just want to add one small thing. It's not really related to it is more related to folk tales in the sense. It is kind of weird, a little bit fucked up to think, like, in a sense, how fey creatures, in the sense, you get like changelings, or I would say, sometimes goblins or elves or all that kind of stuff. Sometimes that was just explanations for differently bodied people.
Or like, don't forget giants. Giants were
Yes.
often used as like some of these stories, some of these creatures were like used as allegories for like
Yes.
different people, other people. So it's not like using these creatures as like an allegory for like otherness. It's not like a bad thing. They've been doing this for like years, but what I'm trying to say is the way that the movie Bright did it was just absolutely god awful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's it. I think it's just something that kind of need to be said. Is obviously there's some of these stories where you have fake creatures, but knowing the context of, like, there's fairy tales about changelings, and there's records showing that, like, people used to think that their children were possessed by changelings, and that's why the bright and happy child became a much more sedentary child much later. And I believe that's kind of the roots, or the seed of the fairy tale for like changelings and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of where it kind of rolls back into mythology, where it's like it is a subtle explanation for, at the time, how they would understand and certain neurological or just like different bodied people or whatever. But that is a broad stroke. It's not 100% true. It's just something I've kind of, I think that is a thing that I believe that is a thing that has happened in history, where we make up these like creatures to explain different ways that the brain works, or how like people's bodies are changed by certain disabilities and all that other kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah.
But, like I said, if you really want to explore something like that, actually like be nuanced and subtle with it, and actually like explore it instead of just being all surface level about it, or don't even like, or even like they don't even say anything new about it. They just be like, oh, like this is bad. It's like, okay, yeah, no kidding, it's bad, but like, is that, if that's all you're gonna say, then it's like I'm not entirely interested, because like there's nothing, it's nothing new. It's nothing new.
Yeah, because I was gonna say, I believe like Bright kind of treated it in a way where, I believe it was all the mythical creatures were kind of more treated. I mean, obviously they were treated like a different race, but it was very tactless, I believe, if I remember correctly. Like I didn't even
It just doesn't feel, it just didn't feel like genuine. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we went a little bit over time, guys. I just want to say thank you for watching. We are M.I.Diverse. I'm Dryw. John's right under me, and Jenna's right over here for me. You can't see them probably. They're waving. But we all wanted to say thank you for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, share. I'm going to be doing some experimentation on how to be sharing on this for all you guys at home, because I think we're learning. I think Facebook is dead. We need to find a different platform to share this on. So please, we have a Twitter. Please, if you see our posts on Twitter, I'm sharing them on my own personal Twitter. So please check it out. I'm gonna be posting on Instagram. Maybe what I should do is I should start posting shorts. So anyway, you guys have a good day. Thank you guys for watching. Do all the fun stuff to help us get our voices out there. And again, you guys have a good one. We'll talk to you later. Bye.